Welcome back to this Halloween-themed episode. Did you remember this is posting right before Halloween, by the way?
No, I did not.
So you just think I'm a nutcase.
I was like, whoa, where's she going with this?
Welcome back to this Halloween-themed episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast. We are talking about insulin and glucose, but a little bit more insulin, actually, because it's kind of demonized. But before I let the dietitian in the house comment on that, can I show you something first? I brought this upstairs specifically to show you, and I wanted to capture your organic response on camera for the people. You ready for this?
Oh my God. Is that a book?
It is a book. Jess brought this home from the library at school.
No way.
And it is titled Boston Terriers Are the Best. And I thought that you would appreciate this work of literary truth.
Joy. I love that.
I thought as a proud mom of a Boston Terrier, you would appreciate that.
Cece needs that book ASAP. She has a book. I don't know if you've ever used Shutterfly before, but I highly recommend. They actually sell where you can make board books. So, you know, the kids' books that have the thicker pages. Yeah. But I've made one with family members, so she can kind of turn it and see like grandma, grandpa, uncles, and aunts and everything. So she likes that one. But I made one just with Chip, and she likes that better than the family one.
Obviously.
But it's, who wouldn't? Chip licking her and Chip's dog bed, them in the wagon together. It's really
the most precious of friendships.
Yeah, it's really cute. But she gets so excited when she reads that book.
That's so cute.
Yeah, but highly recommend Shutterfly board books. They do a really good job. Cool
hashtag
presents. Yeah, hashtag non-sponsored, but they've been turned out really nice when I've made them. And you can usually find like a sale price. Like they're always sending me promotions. It's kind of annoying, but they still get me.
It's kind of like Kohl's. They're always giving out Kohl's cash. Like, how are you in business?
Right. Like, don't feel a sense of urgency necessarily, because the next sale will be the following week. But when you're ready, you should do it, because it seems like good quality and she loves them.
Yeah. I feel like this episode started off completely off the rails, by the way.
It did. That's all right.
Like very ADHD.
But we're coming back very quickly.
We are.
Sometimes we go real off the rails a long time.
That's true. At least it's only, 3 minutes or so. Although, can I keep us off the rails for like another 60 seconds with a funny little story?
Yes.
So when we went to the beach for Jess's weekend a couple weeks ago, I don't think I told you. So we made friends with a family. She made friends with their little girl who's her age, and they had other kids. Well, I befriended their 4-year-old. And we did the thing where like we buried her legs and we made a mermaid tail. We did that no less than 4 times. And she still wanted to keep doing it. And I was like, okay, well, can I get a bit creative? Can I do something other than a mermaid? So I made her bottom half like Ursula.
Oh my gosh.
Like octopus legs. Mm-hmm. And then she insisted that we had to do me so that we could get side-by-side photos. So then the dads had to bury me and make me Ursula tentacles. And then, importantly, I taught her how to do the maniac evildoer laugh. And we have a picture of us going, ah, ha, 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 with our hands like up in claws.
Oh my gosh.
And I will cherish that forever.
Aw. That's so cute.
It's like kid I had never met before, and we just befriended over the course of a weekend. It was so funny.
Oh, I love that. I love the random. Sometimes there's some funny random kids at the park that you'll run into that just like trail you and kind of connect with Cece. Yeah, definitely some characters out there.
Yeah. We lose that as we get into adulthood. We're so deeply worried about what other people think of us. Not us here on the IBS Freedom Podcast, though.
We don't have shame.
You get all the weird here on this podcast.
Right.
Anyway, though, should we get into some nerdy academic kind of stuff? Can we credit some sources first, though? So we both did a teensy bit of, probably Amy more than me, of brushing up on this because admittedly, I don't know about you, but I don't find a ton of my time specifically focusing on like insulin resistance, diabetes, blood sugary type stuff intrinsically, but because you kind of have to be fairly knowledgeable about all the things to make this functional medicine thing work. I think that we both have a good working knowledge, but we brushed up a bit and looked at some of our favorite sources. So, for example, I went back to one of my favorite guys, Brian Walsh, who's a naturopathic doctor. He's an ND, and he has online courses for practitioners, and he's got like some reels and stuff at a YouTube channel. But he's got some really good stuff, particularly when we get into the conversation of why insulin might not be evil and something called the first phase insulin response. A lot of that I'm going to be sharing with you is going to be largely based off of his seminars that I've taken or his blog posts that I was able to pull up as a reference for this conversation. And then Amy, what did you kind of dive into before we even start the conversation?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember listening to Chris Masterjohn's podcast right when it came out. This was episode 20, I think, or in the 20s. But he covered a couple really interesting fundamental metabolic topics. And the one that I mainly listen to, and it's very, very nitty gritty. So I'm just going to try to throw out the main ideas. But it's called Insulin Resistance Isn't All About Carbs and Insulin. That's a really good podcast episode, especially if you want to get really in the weeds. But he's talked about it many times. You might be able to find him on a podcast talking about it too. Other podcasts, but he's a great resource on this. I couldn't find an article specifically with this guy, but I remember reading about it in the past. His name is Stephen Guyenet. Do you remember him? I haven't heard much about him more recently, but
I don't think so.
He actually has a nutrition review website that's really good. I think it's called Red Pen Reviews or something. I'll have to link to it because it is a really good website. So he'll review nutrition books and rank them. Like he'll rate them on different aspects of like readability, scientific citations, like are they good? Are they weak? So he rates nutrition books essentially. But he's a researcher. He's written a book before. But he has written some articles and I didn't find some of the really good ones from the past. I don't know if he archived them or something. But he definitely has written about the carb insulin theory of obesity, or whatever, like kind of combating Gary Taubes and David Ludwig, they're the big proponents of, insulin being a huge driver in metabolic disease and obesity.
I literally just Googled when did Good Calories, Bad Calories come out? Because I wanted to paint a little bit of this picture for historical context. For the record, Gary Taubes' book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, hold on. Can I totally just interrupt you for a sec?
Yeah,
on that purpose?
Sure.
Because you brought up a name I wanted to mention. So I feel like it's really important to know, and I think we've mentioned this before, I've definitely talked about this in FODMAP Freedom, is human beings have a long history of demonizing individual components of food. This is not a new thing. I know we'll oftentimes kind of trace it back to, carbs are the bad guy now. And in the 80s and 90s, fat was the bad guy. But it actually goes further back than that. In the early 1900s, the reason why John Harvey Kellogg came out with Kellogg's cereal is because he wanted a zero protein breakfast option, because he was one of several who thought that protein was the evil in our diet at that time.
Right.
So we've literally demonized every single macro at some point or another over the last 125 years. Right. We demonized protein. Then many years later, we demonized fat. And now the pendulum's just swinging the other direction and we're demonizing carbs. And I guarantee you within our lifetime, within our clinical career, we will demonize one of the other two macros and carbs will be vilified and wonderful and holy again. So I feel like that's important to know. But I think that it was kind of this perfect storm for carbs where... we had some pre-existing research using the ketogenic diet in severe cases of non-medication responsive childhood epilepsy, right? Like that. I mean, I don't know if you even know, I don't know this number, but how far back have we known that the ketogenic diet could be used therapeutically for epilepsy?
A really good question. Interestingly enough, there was a dietitian who would come and speak to our class. I heard her speak twice. She spoke to she's like an expert on keto at Children's Hospital here locally. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure. I know it's been a while. It's been a long time that they've been using it for epilepsy versus just general population. um, Nikki's deep diving. They're sorry for the pause.
Yeah, pardon the pause. Well, I just pulled it up on PubMed because I was curious, at least. Now, granted, there's been a huge surge in the research in the last 10 years or so.
Mm,
But when I typed into PubMed ketogenic title and epilepsy title, the first hit I'm getting is 1931,
yeah.
which is
Yeah,
pretty wild. I actually didn't think it would go that far back. I was figuring it was going to be like 70s, 80s.
that's kind of what I
Now,
was thinking too.
if let's I'll take out some of the low outliers. Like let's go, hold on, I'm just really curious now. Yeah, I mean, even here, I just narrowed it down 1967 to 76. And there are several articles: letter, ketogenic diet and epilepsy, use of ketogenic diet in epilepsy in childhood. Like, so anyway,
Mm,
I guess my point sharing that was we had this long-standing knowledge that the ketogenic diet could be used in severe cases of childhood epilepsy that were not responsive to medications. Then, the gluten-free diet kind of started taking off, I think, first, and that is a carby food. So
mm,
we start to get the popularization of the gluten-free diet, and we start to get like Gary Taub's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, coming out around the same time. And then my guess, I'm not going to research this either, but my guess is that like Mark Sisson's kind of stuff, like Primal Blueprint sort of stuff,
mm.
probably came out around the same time. And then the way I remember it is what I call like the era of paleo
Yeah.
was like 2012 to 2014. Because I remember it was at the very tail end of me being in grad school and maybe the first year or two that I was out of grad school. But by the time I moved here and started practicing in North Carolina in 2015, I was already starting to hear whispers of keto. It wasn't super popular yet, but I was starting to hear about keto. So,
Mm,
it's kind of like we had some research using keto in one particular group, which is great. And then we have a couple of publications come out and like the popularization of recipe blogs and Pinterest, and everybody's pinning paleo recipes left and right. And then because it's the human condition, a lot of us thought, well, if I felt better reducing grains, well, maybe I'd feel better if I just cut out all the carbs. And I think it's like disordered eating
yeah.
affecting our brains. And now we're in this weird place where just carbs are evil, carbs are bad, and insulin specifically is bad. And I don't necessarily think that that is true. So, where do we even want to start this conversation? I feel like this is a beast and it could be like a 5-hour conversation, but we need to keep it
Yeah.
pretty practical.
Well, I mean, I think let's just put into context a bit why insulin has been more demonized. Or again, in the context of the American population, things like obesity is rising. And again, chronic health issues are on the rise, like diabetes, metabolic disease in general. So it makes sense that people are trying to figure this out. They're trying to deep dive to figure out what's causing this. I mean, in reality, I think there's it has a lot to do. The metabolic dysfunction has more to do with the rise in processed foods and just hyper palatable, hypercaloric foods in the diet, more so than any one macronutrient. Um, and again, probably the rise of pollution and other things that pollution um, chemicals and things like that that could really affect how we're regulating inflammation in the body and things like that. So,
I'm glad you
to
brought that up
yeah,
because this goes back also to the idea correlation does not equal causation.
yeah,
And I know that either is going to get like a yay Rashish Gaba reaction, or people are going to roll their eyes and be like, oh. But seriously, I remember, I didn't pull up the notes, so I can't really cite it right now, but I remember there was a naturopath at the Environmental Health Symposium. So it's this yearly conference where they talk about environmental pollutants and
mm,
endocrine disruptors and basically like BPA, phthalates, parabens, PCBs, PFAS, like all of these chemicals that are harming us and are man-made. And I remember the guy talking about diabetes specifically, and he said, yeah, here's the graph everybody loves to show you with the correlation of when we started eating more simple sugar because of the low fat campaign in the 80s. And
mm,
you do see the correlation, like sugar consumption goes up. And in keeping with that pretty perfectly is the increase in type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So that looks like a slam dunk. But then he also shows there's an equally compelling graph, and it was the use of, I forget what chemical it was, or if it was multiple chemicals, but basically some sort of endocrine disruptor, obesogen chemical like BPA or DDT.
mm.
It was something like that. And he said, which is it? Or is it a little bit of both? But he was actually making the argument that it's the chemical crap that we're putting in and on our bodies and we're constantly surrounded by that might be disrupting our insulin response and causing insulin resistance. And that might be even more important than the food. So I would have forgotten about that had you not mentioned that. So thank you.
Yeah, and that's the key aspect. And Chris Masterjohn highlights this beautifully in that podcast that I mentioned, is just there's not one factor in, insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction. It's usually just very multifactorial. But it typically is brought on by um, energy overload. So, and that could be brought on by different reasons. Maybe there's a higher level of total energy, meaning total calories. Maybe that's that you don't have the minerals or the nutrition density to be able to accommodate the metabolism properly. Maybe there's different things like chemicals or you're smoking or something like that that's leading to um, more oxidation and more inflammation. That's messing with the ability of the cell to use energy efficiently and properly. Um, so there's different factors that can be involved. There's not one thing. And I think that's the main hang up. If you're just demonizing one thing, it's like I could probably name 10 things to think about, probably more, if you got really
Yeah.
nitty gritty details. But yeah, and I do want to just talk a little bit about insulin too and what it is. We're jumping.
Fair enough. 19 minutes into the podcast
We're doing
episode, and we
better
have
than
yet to mention
usual.
that.
We're
We
doing
are. It's
better than
okay.
usual.
You get what you get on the IBS Freedom Podcast. No apologies here. But take it away. What is
Woo.
insulin, Amy? Tell us 20
I,
minutes in.
the best way to think about insulin is it is a hormone. It typically responds to high blood sugar or blood sugar increases, I should say. So that's what stimulates insulin because it helps to bring the sugar into the cells, the fuel into the cells once it's in the blood sugar. Um, and again, you can think of it as almost a key that unlocks the cell and lets the glucose in. I always think of insulin as being a really good proxy for short-term fuel. So the way the body almost views insulin is, hey, do I have some quick energy that I can use that's available to me? Like, do I have short-term fuel? And that makes insulin such a crucial hormone because there's so many different systems that are going to respond to whether you have short-term fuel or not. Um, even again, like a good example of this would be reproduction. So, a lot of hormonal things go askew if insulin levels drop too low because the body says, well, she doesn't really have a lot of short-term fuel hanging around to make a baby. So we're just going to shut reproduction off. Or she doesn't have a lot of like short-term fuel around, so we're going to lower thyroid function because we just don't want to be burning through a ton of fuel if we don't have access to short-term stores. So I like to think of it in that way, just broadly, is in my mind, that's kind of what insulin's role is it in the body, is it often tells different systems like, hey, we have some short-term fuel, and different systems react in different ways to that information. Or if it's too low, I think it can cause some disruptions. And again, it can make the body act in a way where it's budgeting energy differently, which it usually does because it's trying to help you in some way, but it can lead to symptoms or dysfunction if you have chronically low levels of insulin. So yeah, I would say that's my broad brush overview, and we can get into the nitty-gritties, but do you have anything to add from just like an insulin definition standpoint?
Yeah, well, not a definition, but I would say something that I occasionally tell patients and students is if you think that insulin is bad for you, talk to a type 1 diabetic
Right.
because they have experienced what life is like without insulin, and they will
Yeah.
quickly tell you that it's no fun. So, I think we need to establish that insulin is necessary for I don't think I've heard of a type 1 diabetic patient who makes zero insulin and was able to get completely off of exogenous insulin being on a keto diet. Like, it's not to say that, lowering carbs couldn't help a person in that situation, but
Mm,
I don't think the goal is ever to get down to zero insulin.
yeah.
It's weird to me, actually. Can I mention this? I'm surprised and ashamed of my own profession because I have seen so many instances where people with no discernible risk of insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes or an insulin issue are getting their fasting insulin checked by a functional medicine
Mm,
doctor. It drives me up the wall. I recently had a patient, kid you not, we had talked about previously that she has iron deficiency. She's gotten low enough before that they've actually done an iron infusion with her before. And we're kind of always watching her ferritin level, and she's fatigued.
mm,
So I had suggested to her when we first met, I said, your other provider that you're working with, they need to know that we can't draw a ton of blood on you. We have to be very sparing with the blood draws that we do for you and only test the absolute necessities because every tube of blood we take out of your body in the name of data collection is one more tube of iron that goes bye-bye out the window.
mm.
And I kid you not, this functional medicine trained MD ordered like 15 vials of blood on this iron deficient patient. One of the tests that she ran for absolutely no reason was fasting insulin. It's like, why? What were you
Yeah.
looking for? I understand
Because
if you
it's the
have somebody.
boogeyman.
Well,
It's
that's
the
the thing. Like, is
Yeah.
it that evil that we have to check this on every single person alive? I understand if somebody is overweight, has high blood pressure, has NAFLD, has a strong family history of type 2 diabetes, has been sedentary for a long time. I understand in certain populations, you might want to use that as part of the greater clinical picture so that you have a metric to watch and kind of check on. But sweet Jesus, man, like don't go taking blood out of my patient who can't afford to have blood taken out if you're testing something that literally has no point for
Yeah.
her.
Yeah. No, totally. I 100% agree. And I think, we probably need to highlight again why there was so much focus on insulin and a little bit maybe about like the theory of why it's kind of demonized. And I think with that, typically, I have a couple points actually with this. So the carb is it called like the carb insulin theory of obesity or something like that, or metabolic disease. Um, and with this theory, it's essentially that, if you overdo it on carbs, that leads to spikes in insulin, which then leads to more storage of the fuel that you're eating and leads you to gain weight and metabolic dysfunction. It's essentially like the Cliff Notes version. Um, I think that is not something that seems to be supported by the majority of the evidence. I don't agree with it. But that's sort of the hypothesis laid out by a lot of functional medicine providers. But like I said, Stephen Guyenet, Chris Masterjohn, there's a bunch of people that sort of argue it really well. Like I was saying before, it seems to be more so caused by energy abundance or energy overload that the cell can't figure out how to use for a number of reasons. But basically, the argument for majority of the people, or at least what I hear, is, if you eat an excess of any macronutrient, you could have metabolic dysfunction, obesity, that kind of thing. So it might be an over fuel issue in general that could be causing things. But then, like I said before, there's other things, the balance of inflammation and antioxidants that are also really critical in how your body's regulating energy. So there's different things to think about there, but that would be kind of the main thing, is that you don't want to necessarily demonize one macronutrient and say, oh, it's like causing metabolic disease, when in reality, I think that there's certain levels of protein and certain levels of carbs most people should be getting, but really it could be an excess of energy typically that drives the dysfunction, not necessarily an excess of carbs solely, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think, if I remember correctly, I could be wrong, but in addition to messing with hormone signaling, including but not limited to insulin, I think I remember hearing or reading somewhere that a lot of these endocrine disrupting obesogen, as they could be called, compounds also, like, basically they mess with your metabolism in a way that they modify your set point, and that's part of why they think we're overeating more and more. Is
Yeah.
like, people are genuinely hungry and they want to eat more, but part of it is they're probably malnourished. They don't have enough vitamins and minerals and fiber, and something inside of them is telling them you need more food, but then they're not eating the food that fills the void that they need to fill. Does that make sense?
You know what it
Like,
reminds me of too? We might have talked about this too. There's a book called The Dorito Effect. I have it here somewhere.
you've mentioned it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's essentially, the theory behind the book is that, and again, I think boiling it down to one thing is never good, but this book does it, and it is an interesting point. Basically saying that the way that we've processed foods and food flavoring tricks the brain in some way of thinking, ooh, I'm getting tons of nutrients when I eat this chip, the Dorito, which is delicious. But if you eat a chip that's a Dorito, sometimes all the flavors in the Dorito, it's like, oh, I'm getting tomato, I'm getting garlic, I'm getting different things. And so it messes with the feedback loop with some of these flavors and what the nutrition profile is with the flavors. So it's a really interesting book. But it almost reminds me of what you're talking about, where it could mess up our body's own ability to regulate
Yeah.
nutrition.
Yeah. Well, there's another book. It's been a lot of years, and I don't even know if I read it. I think I just heard about it. I don't remember the title. I'm probably going to mess up the title name with the Red Hot Chili Peppers album, Blood Sugar Sex Magic.
Yep.
But the title of the book was something like Salt, Fat,
Yeah.
Sugar. or sugar,
Yeah.
salt, fat, something like that. You know what I mean? There was some
Mhm.
book years ago, like in the last 10 years, where they talked about the food industry is very specifically creating the perfect balance of fat, sugar, and salt
Mm.
to make us crave their food and buy it more often. And yeah, it messes with your satiety signals. They don't want you to eat one serving, 1 ounce of Doritos. They want you to abolish the whole bag. So you have to go back to the store and get another bag. That's their goal
Right.
from a marketing perspective. But
Right. Well, and
they
it
have to mess with your satiety and hunger signals in order to do that.
yeah, no, totally. It almost adds to this other element where that I've seen in the demonizing of the carb picture is, all these the Gary Tobbs of the world saying, carbs or sugar, I should say in general, sugar is more addicting than cocaine, like equating sugar to drugs, which is like insane. And it also is funny because they say it's a dopamine response. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, especially historically, evolutionarily speaking, that we would get a boost of dopamine when we had a calorically dense food. So we've
It would
evolved,
teach you to seek that out again.
right? So we've evolved to seek out foods that are calorically dense. Now, I think there is a problem now to some degree where we're not hunting and gathering food anymore, and food is so widely available um, that there can be some issues there too. Especially the hyper palatable. I never know how to pronounce that food. The very delicious food, the candies, the chips, the this or that, which are delicious, and I eat these sometimes. So I'm not trying to demonize them either. But when they're so widely available, and our brains are so wired to select those foods, I think again, like there can be issues where someone might be eating high levels of overall calories, which then could lead to insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. Um, but again, you can't necessarily just say, "Oh, it's the carbs," um, and we can't demonize all the very reasonable physiological responses to carbs. Again, like to me, it's a good thing you might get a dopamine hit when you have a carb. It tastes good and it feels good to eat the carbs. Now, again, could there be some issues, like I said, with just how readily available some of these really high calorie foods are now? Potentially.
Yes. Or I'll thread something else in too. Um, I think that we are living lives seeking the quick, easy little dopamine hit. So another good
Hmm.
example is stuff like TikTok,
Yeah.
right? Like every time you scroll or every time you get a like on a post, you're getting a little dopamine hit from that. Well, what if we're just dopamine deficient because we live a life and we're not connecting with anybody and we're not
Mm.
going outside anymore?
Right. Right.
This was a problem even before 2020, but now in the last few years, it's been absolutely a huge problem. And that's a whole nother element to this potentially is like, are we seeking things like TikTok? Are we seeking things like social media and
Mm.
Doritos and whatever else? Are we seeking these things out because our life inherently lacks the things that
Mm.
would naturally give us dopamine back in the day,
Yeah, it's a really
right?
good point. It's a really
We
good
don't
point.
we don't have the community and the physical touch and the social interaction that we used to. At least most of us don't. Um,
Yeah,
but
like this little dopamine hit from eating a potato or a fruit would be like, but that'd be a little bit of a different situation. But like a little dopamine hit from eating a cookie or something might not be as big of a deal to someone who has a very full, rich, nutrient dense life elsewhere.
yeah,
Um, yeah,
versus if you don't have a lot of that kind of stimulation and then you eat that
mm,
cookie, it's going to be like, oh, this was
right,
the best thing of my entire life, and it makes it that much more addictive.
right.
I'll throw out another layer to the question. We have several more layers to go, by the way, but here's another one. So these are 2 points from honestly, I think he articulates it so well and it's short enough. I'm just going to read you two little snippets from one of Brian Walsh's blog posts.
Yeah.
It's titled Insulin, Villain, or Scapegoat.
Mm.
Oh. So he said, let's look at 3 reasons why insulin should be added to your falsely accused list. Number 1, insulin is anti-inflammatory. What? What? That's cuckoo. He says hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, is considered very pro-inflammatory. There is speculation in research that one of the reasons insulin increases during hyperglycemia is to combat the inflammation caused by high glucose. That would make sense. When there's inflammation, send in the anti-inflammatory troops. Holy macaroni. Now, point number 2, and then I'll open up the field for discussion. Point 2, insulin resistance is protective. What? What do you mean, Brian Walsh? He says, studies suggest that insulin resistance is a cellular defense mechanism to protect the body, not damage it. In other words, when there's metabolic anarchy happening inside the cell, insulin resistance may provide the necessary reprieve. On this, researchers are calling into question whether we should give hyperglycemic, hyperinsulinemic patients exogenous insulin, as that might further contribute to the intracellular chaos and worsen the condition. So basically, like, I remember I attended one of his seminars in, I think it was spring of 2019, and I still remember it clearly. He said, the best way to explain that concept is if you have a party in your apartment and you are totally full to capacity and it's like a really wild party, it's getting out of hand. Say that your apartment should only ever hold 20 people, but you have 25 people in there and they're like smashing beer bottles and they're going crazy. The smart thing to do would be to lock the door and not let anybody else in that cell. But if we come along with herbs or drugs to forcibly push open the door, which would be essentially treating insulin resistance is the door closing and saying, no, thank you. No, you other party goers can stay in the hallway, please. We don't want you inside the cell. We've got enough craziness going on in here.
Right.
But the minute we come with an axe and we chop down the door and we forcibly allow the glucose or the party goers inside the cell/party, that could actually be a really bad thing. We have to make sure that the person is able to handle that and have proper, vitamins and minerals and working on things like mitochondria health. But I thought that that was a really profound but easy to understand way to look at this. And it really does make you think insulin is not intrinsically bad. And maybe maybe we've been looking at insulin resistance the wrong way.
Yeah, no, totally. It's a good example of the body doing things that we think are dysfunctional, but in reality are trying to help you. So again, the body's trying to
We
regulate
think
your.
we're so smart.
We do. I
Our
think
little
it's
smarty pants brains up there.
we're just dummies, bunch of big dummies half the time. But
Well, I feel like on some level there is this element of so much of medicine and even like functional medicine and herbal medicine, like so much of it can take on the tone of trying to outsmart Mother Nature
yeah,
and
yeah,
like forcing the body to do something versus getting to the real root cause of what's going on and figuring out like, oh, okay, why does this person's body think that this is an okay or advantageous thing to do? Like, what is it really struggling with and how do we help them?
yeah. And I think too to expand on your point of having a bunch of crazy people in the cell, like smashing bottles, just raising hell. How do you maybe get them? How do you, this sounds weird, burn them because I'm trying to think of from like a fuel standpoint. Like,
How do you usher them out of the party,
right.
perhaps?
How do you usher them out of their party or get them to clean up, like do something productive? How do you burn fuel efficiently or release the fuel um, more efficiently? So, from my standpoint, like I said, if there's an overwhelming calorie excess. That's going to be problematic. But I think for a lot of people that we work with too, I think it can be more inflammatory driven. So if there are not enough vitamins and minerals that can help you regulate inflammation properly. So if you're nutrient depleted, like so many of our clients are, it can really affect energy metabolism, and it could lead your cells to become overwhelmed and not able to process energy properly. And then you have things like insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction and a lot of problems that can kind of stem from that. Because I know Chris Masterjohn, like his endpoints are just like nutrient density, focus on that a ton. It's like so simple. Nutrient density can really help regulate the inflammation because it provides the tools to process the excess energy properly.
Well, and to your point, that's you could picture the vitamins and minerals and maybe other nutrients like phytochemicals too, but that's what helps usher the people out of the party like, oh, okay, you've overstayed your welcome. Let's get you out of here. Like you have to process the fuel and kind of move on, so to speak, so that you can let other party goers into the cell. But if you think about, okay, dietitian in the house, how many times have you looked at somebody's chronometer and seen that they are nailing every single vitamin and mineral and fiber?
Oh God. Probably
0?
never. Yeah, never.
I'm going to wager 0 times in your
Yeah.
clinical career.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Ditto.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I think some people are like, oh, I'm pretty solid on that. And then we'll actually review their data. And I'm like, oh, let's just check. Like I play coy. We're just going to do it as an exercise. And of course, there's something that we have to work on. But yeah, no, it's such a good point. How many people, majority, I would say 99% of people are struggling nutritionally in some facet or another.
At least one.
Yeah.
At least one thing. Like none of us are so perfect
Yeah.
that we don't have a single nutrient that we could focus on a bit more. Now, okay, this could be a whole nother conversation potentially. The conversation of excess energy intake and having excess energy to process inside the cell, or like excess fuel that needs to be processed inside the cell and out the bloodstream. There's also a wide world of research that I know nothing about, which is how much energy is harvested from your gut microbiome. So when you eat a certain number of calories, there are calories that never make it to you because your gut microbiome sequesters and uses some of that energy for itself. I know nothing about that though. I know that the only thing I know is that I've seen some research where they compare the gut microbiome of people with diabetes versus the gut microbiome of people who are like healthy, normal controls. And they say that the gut microbiome harvests, that's usually the term that's used, the microbiome harvests more energy from the diet in the people without diabetes versus the people with diabetes. That microbiome is not harvesting as much or like sequestering as much of the energy for their own use.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a whole nother enchilada.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And I know that there's some research too in mice where they've extracted microbiota from, an obese mouse and put it into a thin mouse or whatever, and the mouse became obese, which is super interesting. And there could be a lot of different mechanisms to that. There could be some additional inflammation that comes into play too from a microbiota standpoint that could lead to metabolic dysfunction. And again, the energy overload in the cell could be driven a little bit maybe by some of the inflammation from gut microbes.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's crazy.
And then here's one more. Again, I'm going to read it from Brian Walsh's little 3-parter blog post. His third point, he says, insulin resistance is antimicrobial. What? So he says, not only does the presence of lipopolysaccharide, LPS, seem to cause insulin resistance, But during infection, there seems to be an increased glucose requirement by phagocytic cells. Insulin resistance facilitates glucose availability for those cells to help fight the infection rather than giving it to other cells like muscle or fat. So keeping your
Whoa.
blood sugar elevated allows
Mm.
your white blood cells to use the glucose more readily, which actually might help your immune system work better in certain circumstances. How wild is that as a concept? So, and then pairing this with a little fun fact I know I've shared before, I came across this article maybe a month or two or three ago, but only 5% of the American public gets enough dietary fiber. 5% people,
Yeah. I think the
but
average is like 15 grams or something.
which is not good.
Yeah.
But the killer part of this is 67% of Americans believe they are getting enough fiber. So similar what you were saying with Chronometer, and you have to kind of be a little coy, like, let's just check. Let's
Yeah.
just see. I feel like the same sometimes with people because even honestly, my neighbor recently, she went gluten-free and I brought up the idea of checking her fiber and she's like, oh, I do good. And she gardens and she's pretty healthy, but she was kind of like really proud of herself. And she told me, yeah, I'm getting like 50 or 60%. Yeah. And I'm like,
Right.
so you're
Right.
not getting enough. Like that's feeling
Right.
great. But,
Right.
I'm trying to help her gradually. She's my neighbor. She's not a client or anything. But anyway, and there's research, particularly in children, that children who are obese or going towards type 2 diabetes have higher intake of simple carbs that do not have fiber and lower intake of fiber compared to healthy normal kids. So it's like we live in this world that's made up of a toxic soup
Yeah.
of,
Yeah.
BPA and glyphosate and God knows what. Then we are fed this never ending stream of foods that are super high in calories and devoid of fiber and devoid of vitamins and minerals and addictive as all get out.
Mm.
We grow up, we live much of our lives eating addictive, high calorie, low nourishment, low fiber stuff. Our gut microbiome starts to tank and the diversity and the health of the microbiome goes down because we're not eating enough fiber and we're not eating a variety of plant foods. Then we
Right.
get into our adulthood and we have all of these inflammatory and metabolic diseases. And it's, to look at that complex of a picture and then just say, oh, it's the sugar and the insulin that's the problem. I think it's really silly. I don't think it's
Yeah.
any one item, but
Oh, yeah, and we'll talk about, I think it's a good time then to talk about what then the popular solution is to cut out the carbs and the
oh, certain.
sugar.
What is the popular solution, Amy?
Yeah, it's to just say you need to go keto or you need to go low carb and
Get out of
that'll
here,
take
carbs.
care of the whole problem. But in reality,
Magic.
it doesn't fix the problem because the problem is typically energy overload. Now it can lower insulin. So that was the whole point that Chris Masterjohn kind of makes in his podcast is, it will lower insulin, but you really don't want chronically low insulin for a long period of time. He said it could be helpful for a short period of time, but once you've done it too long, there's a lot of negative ramifications of having insulin be terribly low. One in particular, too, that I'll bring up that he talks about is it lowers the antioxidant. Like if you're cutting out fruits and cutting out different things, even vegetables, if someone's really low carb, if you're cutting out all these nutrients, it decreases the nutrients needed for your antioxidant defense systems to lower inflammation in the cells, so it can lead to more metabolic dysfunction. It also lowers glutathione. You need insulin to make glutathione, which is
Ah,
the main antioxidant of your cell. Like that's a huge problem in our space, I think, is if someone does cut too much out, and it's not even carbs, it could be nutrients related to glutathione. Um, if you cut too many of the nutrients related to glutathione and you already have maybe a little bit more inflammation, so your body needs is using more glutathione, it creates a lot of problems long term from a glutathione standpoint.
well, and to thread this in real quick, going back to the idea of too many party goers inside the party and there's chaos and beer bottles getting smashed, one scientific way we could explain that is mitochondrial dysfunction or mitochondrial-based inflammation. Well, you want to talk about something that's really super duper mega important for mitochondria function, it's glutathione.
Right.
So that is horrific to think of somebody decreasing their glutathione and antioxidant capacity by cutting out a lot of fruits and veggies.
Yeah.
Now,
It's almost like I think glutathione could be synonymous to like packaging up all those party goers that are disruptive, that are causing inflammation, like just wrapping them up and sending them away, like packaging them up so they're not inflammatory anymore.
yeah. By the way,
Yeah.
just for the record, I want to share before I forget. When I'm picturing this out of control party, I am envisioning Crackhead Steve is in the room, by the way.
Good.
Like
Excellent.
he's part of the party that's getting out of control.
Yeah.
Just for the record. If you
I'm
don't know who
picturing
Crackhead Steve is,
Evanescence playing maybe in the background.
Sure. Yeah.
Like Bring Me to Life or something where they're like
that actually would fit really well with this picture, I
crashing.
feel like.
Yeah.
Yes. If you don't know who Crackhead Steve is, go back to, what is it, episode 4 of season 2.
Episode 104, 105. I think we talked about it both.
Basically the
episodes.
OCD episodes we did. But just the tangled web we weave. And if I could share something too, I was actually talking to Mike about this last night. So we were winding down and he was showing me a clip from a podcast that he likes. I like the guy too. I just don't follow him as much. But the guy was basically making the point that if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, you probably need to take a B12 supplement. And he was saying, it's entirely possible to be a vegan and be healthy. But he said sometimes people will make the argument that they've been vegan for a year or 2 years or whatever, and they feel great, and they've never taken a vitamin supplement or a B12 supplement, and they're fine without it. And I'm not familiar with this. I have not fact checked this at all. This was new to me. He suggested that, you'll feel good in the beginning, but after a couple of years, when your liver stores of B12 are depleted, then you'll basically feel the effects of the deficiency. That was new news to me. I don't know if I knew that the liver stored B12, or maybe I knew it once and I forgot it. But I think also, I've wondered with a lot of different diets, and you could say this, I think, for vegan, vegetarian, juice cleanses, Whole30, paleo, AIP, whatever it might be. I really wonder, is the benefit that people see in the first month or 2 or 3 of a diet actually due to that diet being magical? Or is it just because they cut out all the processed shit? Right?
Yeah.
Like if you go from eating a standard American diet to eating vegan, you're going to be eating a lot less processed crap. And that in and of itself, regardless of the contents of what you're eating, is probably going to make you feel like $1 million. Similarly, there are people who go from standard American to like a Whole30 and they feel amazing. And they think, oh, it's because grains were evil and Whole30 paleo is the answer. Is it? Or is it just because you cleaned up your diet and this was like motivation for you to do that? So I think the same thing could probably be said of keto at times. If, especially initially, if you're like part of a program or you just read a book or you made a resolution and you're like, you have like the motivation and the dopamine fueling you too. And you're like, this is new and this is going to be the cure, the answer for all my problems. Hooray. And I'm in this Facebook group and everybody says it's a miracle cure. And I just listened to a podcast episode and I read a book and it says, this is the miracle cure for everything humans suffer from. This is it. It's like you have that optimism, that hope, that dopamine, and then you go into it and you're also maybe adopting a diet that has a bit less processed shit food and chemical component to it. And it's like, well, yeah, of course you feel better for a while, but after a while, I think your metabolism starts to get kind of effed up not having any carbs. Doesn't that stand to reason?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I believe it's so popular because it simplifies things too much. And I don't necessarily think the solution is overly complicated that we're suggesting. But from my end, again, it's a nutrient-dense diet. anytime you cut out foods, you run the risk of developing deficiencies over time. And that should always be a risk factor if you're doing any dietary intervention. And sometimes the benefits of that are worth it, but it's still a con. Anytime you remove a food, it decreases the diversity of foods that you can pull from to get the nutrients that you need. So that should always be weighed into the equation. And the demonization of certain foods, especially things like carbs, um, again, create a lot of problems because again, it's this expert mentality of, oh, I just want to like have the simple solution that this expert is telling me to eat, and I'm not necessarily going to listen to the cues. Or, I might have like this little twinge that says, this doesn't feel right. And I'm not going to listen to that. I'm just going to keep blustering through with this keto. But yeah, I've definitely seen people long-term keto have problems. The crazy thing for me, and I can't believe I haven't brought it up, my blood sugar was never worse than when I ate low carb. So that's the other thing. There's individual factors, and some people generally might have a carb threshold that they just feel better eating. So I'm not necessarily trying to demonize that some people might need to be more careful with carbs or for a period of time or long term. It could depend. Everybody has a specific, I think, carb point that makes sense for them. So it could lead to some exploration. But for me, again, I was freaked out of carb, sugar, and I was way better off adding carbs and sugar, especially like high quality sugar for the most part. And again, having some balance into my diet with treats, I was much better off adding carbs back in. From a blood sugar standpoint, too, from a metabolic standpoint, just my body seemed to process carbs way better than it did a high fat diet. So part of this too is there's going to be individual differences between people as to what something like this looks like. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like this
Again, I'll
whole
say it again, the tangled web we weave.
Mm.
And I still have a couple more things to throw in the mix. And
I
then you do too?
I I do too, and it probably doesn't fit right now. I had it in my mind to say it earlier, but it just got away from me. The paleo mom, which we're trying to get her on the pod, right?
Yeah.
She has a really, I mean, this I remember reading like back in the day. Um, but it was from June. It was from on the Paleo Mom's website, June 18th, 2018. And it says the case for more carbs, insulin's non-metabolic roles in the human body. That article's really good. She goes into like every other system that uses insulin and why it's important. She kind of highlights some of the hormonal things we've talked about. She talks about how it's important for muscle growth, for bone health, for the nervous system. Again, like if you're freaked out of insulin, you should go check out that article too.
That's muy excelente. Let me ask you this, by the way. Do we have enough to continue sharing that we should end now and make this a two-parter and share the rest of it in next week's episode? Because I feel like I could just share these couple of things and kind of bust them out, but we could also noodle on them a bit, and then maybe we could get into the practical application, like what do you do in the next episode if we made this a two-parter.
And I almost wonder too, do we talk a little bit about like I don't know if it'd be relevant. We've already done some blood sugary episodes, like what
We have.
happens to gut function or like why it might be important.
We could fold that in a little bit again. Guys, I think you're watching the planning happen in real time right now. I'm going to call it. Let's, stepping into producer mode, Nikki.
Wow.
Let's call this one here, wrap it up at about an hour, and then we will see you next week for the unexpected part 2 to this episode because we had so much good stuff to tell you about. My goodness gracious. But hopefully we wet your whistle just enough that you are now less skeptical and scared of insulin, and maybe more willing to think about adding some carbs in your life. Time will tell, but we will see you in part 2 before you know it.